The smoke still hadn't fully cleared when I heard the floorboard crack behind me. I spun around, heart slamming against my ribs, a broken curtain rod clutched in both hands. The flashlight I'd propped on the windowsill threw a pale, shaking beam across the room. Dust motes swirled. The back door, the one I hadn't been able to lock because the latch was rusted clean through, was still closed. Just the house settling, I told myself. Old houses do that. I set down the curtain rod and turned back to the fireplace. The crumpled grocery receipt I'd used as kindling had caught, and small orange tongues were licking at the edge of a split log I'd found on the back porch. The wood was damp. It smoked more than it burned. But it was something. It was warmth, or the beginning of it, and I hadn't had that in 3 days. I pulled my coat tighter and sat down on the floor in front of the fire. Through the window, I could see the outline of the old oak tree my mother used to read under when she was a girl. Now it was November, and every branch was bare, and I was sitting alone in my grandmother's farmhouse in rural Pennsylvania with $17 in my checking account and nowhere else on earth to go. 4 months ago, I had a fiancé, an apartment in Philadelphia, and a job I loved. 3 months ago, I found out none of it was real. His name was Daniel, and I met him the way you meet a lot of people in your late 20s at a mutual friend's birthday party, a little too much wine, a conversation that went until 2 in the morning about things that actually mattered. He was a financial consultant. Tall, steady. The kind of man who remembered things: your coffee order, the name of your childhood dog, the anniversary of your mother's death. I thought that kind of attentiveness was love. I was 31 years old, and I still hadn't learned the difference between someone who pays attention because they care and someone who pays attention because information is useful. We moved in together after 8 months. He proposed after 14. It was a Tuesday evening, nothing dramatic. He'd made dinner, set the table with candles, gotten down on one knee in our own kitchen. I cried. He wiped my face with his thumb and said, "I've been waiting my whole life to find someone like you, Claire." I believed every word. I was a physical therapist at a rehabilitation center in the city. I'd worked there for 6 years. I had patients. I genuinely cared about a 70-year-old retired firefighter relearning to walk after a stroke, a teenage girl recovering from a spinal injury, a veteran named Marcus who made me laugh every single session. My work wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and I was good at it. Daniel's work, I understood less. He traveled often. He had clients he couldn't discuss in detail, NDAs, he said. Standard stuff. He wore nice suits and carried a titanium card and always seemed to know the right person in every room. I trusted him the way you trust someone when you've decided you're building a life with them. Completely. Foolishly. The first sign came in May. I came home from a double shift to find him on the phone in the bedroom with the door closed, which he'd never done before. When he came out, he was slightly too calm. Asked about my day a beat too quickly. I noticed. But I told myself I was tired, reading into things. The second sign came 6 weeks later. I found a receipt in the pocket of his jacket. I was taking it to the dry cleaner from a hotel in downtown Philadelphia. The date was a Thursday. He told me he was in Baltimore that Thursday for a client meeting. The hotel was 4 blocks from our apartment. I put the receipt back in the pocket. I took the jacket to the dry cleaner. I drove home and sat in the parking garage for 40 minutes trying to decide if I was the kind of woman who looked through her fiancé's phone. I wasn't. But I did it anyway. What I found wasn't dramatic, not in the way movies prepare you for. There were no explicit messages, no confessions. Just a name, Melissa, recurring across several months. Dinner. Coffee. Can't talk right now. I'll call you later. And one message, sent at 11:47 on a Wednesday night, that said simply, "I miss you too." I put the phone back exactly where I found it. I went to bed. I lay there in the dark next to the man I was going to marry, and I stared at the ceiling and I thought, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Melissa is a colleague. Maybe I miss you too means something else, something professional, something I'm too exhausted to understand right now. I thought that for 3 weeks. And then I stopped thinking it. I didn't confront him right away. I know that sounds weak. But I'd grown up watching my mother confront my father loudly, frequently, and always without enough proof, and I'd watched him talk his way out of every single time. I wanted to be sure. I needed to be sure. So I paid attention. Daniel had a home office. He kept it locked, which he'd always explained as a habit from years of handling sensitive client documents. I'd never questioned it. Now, I thought about it differently. The key was on his keychain. His keychain hung on the hook by the front door every night when he came home. One evening in late July, he fell asleep on the couch watching television. I slipped the key off the ring. I told myself I'd put it back before he woke up. I told myself I just needed to see. The office was neat. Very neat. Daniel was always neat. I sat down at his desk and opened the top drawer, and inside, beneath a legal pad and 2 pens, was a folder. Inside the folder were bank statements for an account I had never seen before, held in a bank I didn't recognize. Not our joint account. Not any of the accounts he'd ever shown me. This one had a balance that made me sit very still for a long moment. Nearly $400,000. I didn't understand it. I took photos of every page with my phone. I put the folder back. I locked the office. I rehung the key before he woke up. I said nothing at dinner. I said nothing for 2 more weeks. I found a financial attorney through my friend Nora, who handled divorces and knew everyone in the city's legal community. The attorney's name was Patricia. I emailed her the photos from a Gmail account I created on my lunch break, on my work computer, logged out immediately after. Patricia called me that afternoon. She was very calm. She asked several questions I didn't fully understand. Then she said, "Claire, depending on where this money came from, your fiancé may have a serious legal problem. And if you've been living with him for over a year, you may have standing here." I asked, what kind of standing? She said she'd need more information before she could say. I asked how long I had. She said, "That depends on how soon things change." Things changed faster than I expected. I came home on a Thursday evening in August to find Daniel standing in the kitchen with his arms crossed and an expression on his face I had never seen before. Not anger exactly. Something colder than anger. He said, "Patricia Huang's office called my number by mistake. They were trying to reach a Claire Whitmore. About a financial consultation." I set my bag down on the counter. He said, "You want to tell me what that's about?" I looked at him for a long moment. This man, whose thumb had wiped my tears. This man, who remembered things. I said, "No." The next hour was not quiet. He didn't hit me. I want to be clear about that. But he said things I will not repeat here because I have decided that certain words don't deserve to be repeated. He said I was paranoid. He said I was jealous and ungrateful and that I'd been looking for reasons to destroy something good. He said Melissa was a former colleague he'd worked with in Boston, that they'd stayed in touch, that there was nothing there, that I was making something out of nothing. He said the account, when I told him I'd seen it, was an inheritance from his uncle that he hadn't disclosed because he'd wanted to handle it privately before we were married. He had answers for everything. He always had answers. But his hands were shaking when he talked. And I noticed. I told him I needed some time. I told him I was going to stay with Nora for a few days. He told me that if I walked out the door right now, I should consider carefully whether I was walking out for good. He used the word ultimatum very carefully, like he'd prepared it. I picked up my bag. I walked out. I stayed with Nora for 11 days. On the 12th day, Daniel called and said he'd moved some of his things to his mother's. He said the apartment was mine if I wanted it. He said he needed time too. He sounded like someone reading from a script, and I realized I had probably always been hearing a script, I just hadn't recognized it as one. I went back to the apartment. I tried to go back to my life. And then, 3 weeks later, I was called into my manager's office at work and told that a formal complaint had been filed against me. I will be honest, I had not seen that coming. The complaint alleged that I had behaved inappropriately with a patient, specifically, that I had been physically aggressive during a session. The patient named was someone I'd been treating for 4 months. Someone who had, 2 weeks prior, been CC'd on an email chain I now realized I should have looked at more carefully. Someone whose wife, I later learned from Nora, had done her undergraduate degree with Daniel's sister. I'm not saying that proves anything, I'm saying the timing was precise. I was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. I was not permitted to work. I was not permitted to contact my patients. I sat in my car in the parking lot after the meeting and I did not cry, which surprised me. I thought I would cry. Instead, I felt very clear, the way you feel sometimes in an emergency, not calm exactly, but focused. Like all the noise gets cut and you can see the exact shape of the thing in front of you. The exact shape was this. Daniel had connections. Daniel knew people. Daniel had known, from the moment I walked out of that apartment, that the most effective way to neutralize me was to take away the one thing I hadn't gotten from him, my career, my identity, the thing I'd built entirely on my own. I drove home, I packed a bag. I called my landlord and gave 30 days notice. I had enough in my personal savings to last about 2 months if I was careful. I didn't know yet where I was going. Then I remembered the farmhouse. My grandmother had died 4 years earlier. She'd left the property of Farmhouse and 11 acres in a small town called Millhaven, about 3 hours west of Philadelphia, to my mother, who had died 2 years before her. Which meant it had passed to me. I'd never done anything with it. I'd paid the property taxes every year from a sense of obligation I couldn't quite articulate. I hadn't been there since I was 19. I drove there on a Sunday in October with 2 suitcases, a box of kitchen supplies, a sleeping bag, and my laptop. The laptop was important, I was going to need it. The house was worse than I remembered. The front porch had half rotted. 2 windows were cracked. Inside, everything smelled of damp and old wood and something animal that had maybe lived in the walls at some point. The electricity was still technically connected, but the breaker kept tripping, so I had power in about half the rooms. The water ran, barely, and cold only. The furnace was dead. I stood in the middle of the kitchen for a long time that first afternoon. Then I found a broom and I started sweeping. The first 2 weeks were the hardest, I won't pretend otherwise. I had no routine, no patience, no reason to set an alarm. I'd built my entire adult identity around being useful to people, and now I was alone in a broken house in a town where I didn't know anyone, trying not to think about the fact that my career was under investigation, and my almost marriage was over, and I had made several very expensive mistakes. I let myself feel terrible for exactly 14 days. I cried on day 3 and day 7 and day 11. I ate soup out of cans and sat by the fire. I got better at building, and I watched the bare trees through the window, and I thought about everything I should have done differently. On day 15, I opened my laptop and started working. I had savings, but they wouldn't last forever. More importantly, I had skills. 6 years of clinical physical therapy translates, surprisingly well, into online consulting, remote assessments for patients with mild mobility issues, written treatment plan reviews for small clinics that can't afford full-time staff, continuing education content for PT students. I'd known about this market for years. I'd never had a reason to enter it before. I emailed 8 potential clients in one day. 3 responded within 48 hours. By the end of week 3, I had 2 paying clients and a third on retainer. It wasn't much, but it was mine. I also started fixing the house, partly out of practicality, and partly because I needed something to do with my hands. I watched YouTube videos about replacing weather stripping and recaulking windows and how to relight a pilot light on an old furnace. The furnace turned out to be beyond me. I eventually called a technician from a town 20 minutes away, a quiet man named Robert, who fixed it in 40 minutes and charged me less than I expected and didn't ask any questions about why I was alone out here. I appreciated that. The neighbor I met by accident. Her name was June, and she was 63, and she'd lived in the yellow house at the end of my grandmother's old access road for 31 years. She knocked on my door one morning in early November carrying a cast iron pot of soup because, she said, she'd seen smoke from the chimney for 3 weeks and figured whoever was in there was either alive and cold or dead, and she wanted to know which. I laughed for the first time in a month. She came in, we had soup. She told me she remembered my grandmother. She said the old woman had been stubborn and private and had grown the best tomatoes in the county, and I said that sounded exactly right. June didn't ask me why I was there. She just asked if I needed anything, and I said maybe company sometimes, and she said she could do that. She could do that. Patricia, my attorney, had not stopped working while I was gone. I'd shared everything with her, the photos of the bank statements, the name of the bank, the account number. Over the following weeks, she and a forensic accountant she brought in began to trace the money. I won't pretend I understood all of it. But the essence of it was this. A significant portion of those funds had flowed through accounts that Daniel and I had held jointly during our engagement, a shared savings account we'd opened to save for the wedding, and a credit card in both our names. Under Pennsylvania law, Patricia explained, this created a legal claim on my behalf, not for the full amount, but for a traceable portion that had moved through joint instruments. Daniel's attorney, who I learned about when Patricia forwarded me their first letter, argued that I had no standing, that I'd been a de facto tenant rather than a domestic partner, that the joint accounts were incidental. Patricia sent back a 22-page response. I'm not going to lie, watching a competent woman dismantle someone's legal strategy on my behalf was one of the more satisfying experiences of my adult life. The investigation at work concluded in December. The findings were inconclusive, which, in the language of HR, means they couldn't prove the allegation, but they also weren't ready to fully exonerate me. I was not reinstated. I was offered a severance package in exchange for a release of claims. Patricia reviewed it and told me to take it. I took it. It wasn't justice. I want to be clear about that. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't what I deserved, and the colleague who had filed the complaint against me, whether or not he'd done it because of Daniel, or simply because he'd misremembered or misrepresented a session, was still there, still treating patients, still employed. But I was not in a position to fight two battles at once. I focused on the one I could win. There's a particular kind of winter in rural Pennsylvania that people who grew up in cities don't understand. It's not just cold. It's quiet in a way that presses against you, that gets inside the walls of a house and into the space between thoughts. Some people would find it unbearable. I found, unexpectedly, that I did not. June came by twice a week, we watched old movies, and she taught me which of the trees on my property were worth keeping and which were dying. I started taking walks in the morning, long ones, through the fields behind the house, in the early gray light before the rest of the world was awake. I hadn't taken a walk for pleasure in years. I'd always been going somewhere, rushing from one appointment to the next, filling every gap. I didn't know, until I stopped, how exhausted I'd been. I thought about Daniel less than I expected to. What I thought about more was the version of myself that had been with him, always slightly adjusted, always slightly smaller, always wearing clothes that he'd called more polished and ordering food he'd called a better choice and laughing at things I didn't find funny because his approval had become such an ambient need that I'd stopped noticing it as a need at all. Out here, in my grandmother's house, with no one to adjust for, I found her again slowly. The person I'd been before. Or maybe a new version, quieter, more careful, and considerably less willing to be managed. I repainted the kitchen in February. A pale sage green, the color my grandmother had it when I was small. I fixed the porch boards, mostly. I couldn't get them level, but they held weight and didn't creak anymore. June brought me tomato seedlings in March and showed me where my grandmother had kept her garden, and I cleared the bed and turned the soil and planted them in rows, telling myself I'd probably still be here, come summer, and finding that the thought didn't scare me the way I'd expected. The settlement came through in April. I won't give the exact number. It was not life-changing in the way people mean when they say life-changing. It was not enough to retire on or buy something extravagant. It was enough to cover the repairs the house needed, pay off my remaining debt, and give me a cushion that meant I didn't have to take every single client who reached out to me. I could be selective. I could breathe. Patricia called to tell me, and I sat on the front porch steps in the thin spring sunlight and listened to her explain the terms, and when she finished I said, "Thank you. For all of it." She said, "That's what I'm here for." I said, "How's Melissa?" "Did Daniel ever clarify that?" Patricia laughed. she said. His attorney stopped mentioning her around February. I said, interesting. I never found out who Melissa really was. I decided, at some point, that it didn't matter. What had mattered was what was mine, my integrity, my work, my name, and the battle I'd chosen was always about that, not about him. Daniel sent me one email, in March, 4 lines long. It said he was sorry about how things had ended. That he'd made mistakes, that he hoped I was doing well. It had the formal, slightly airless tone of something written with a lawyer looking over his shoulder, and I read it twice and then moved it to a folder I labeled irrelevant and closed my laptop. I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that the settlement hadn't said more cleanly. The tomatoes came in by mid-July, the way my grandmother had always said they would, too many at once, all at the same time, demanding to be dealt with. June came over on a Saturday and we spent the afternoon canning. Her kitchen was better equipped for it, but I had more tomatoes, so we compromised. We used her jars and my fruit and my grandmother's old recipe, which June had apparently also had a copy of for 30 years, written on a note card in my grandmother's handwriting. I looked at that note card for a long time. My grandmother had never met Daniel. She died before I moved to Philadelphia, before I became the woman who'd shrunk herself to fit inside someone else's idea of a life. She only knew me as the 19-year-old who'd visited this house in summer, who'd sat on the porch swing and read paperbacks and helped her in the garden without being asked. I think she would have been angry on my behalf. Quietly, sustainedly angry, the way old farm women get angry, not with scenes or confrontations, but with an absolute refusal to pretend things were fine when they weren't. I think she would have approved of the lawsuit. I think she would have approved of Patricia. I think she would have approved of me, standing in her kitchen in July, making tomato preserves with her neighbor, in her house that I'd fixed and repainted and chosen, deliberately and fully, as mine. I sealed the last jar and set it on the rack to cool. Through the window, the 11 acres stretched out in the late afternoon light, green and unhurried, completely indifferent to everything that had happened in Philadelphia. The garden was full. The porch held. The furnace worked. I was 32 years old. I had a career I was rebuilding on my own terms, in a field I'd chosen because I genuinely believed in it. I had a house that had asked nothing of me except that I show up and do the work. I had a neighbor who knocked on my door when she saw smoke and assumed I was worth checking on. I had myself back. That was not a small thing. I didn't know yet what came next. I wasn't ready to think about Philadelphia, or dating, or any of the big forward-looking questions that people ask you when they're trying to be encouraging. Those questions belong to a different chapter, and I'd learned, this year more than any other year of my life, not to skip ahead. For now, the light was good, and the tomatoes were done. And June was telling a story about my grandmother that I'd never heard before, something about a county fair in 1987 and a blue ribbon she'd won and immediately given away to a 9-year-old who'd cried when her own entry lost. I leaned against the counter and listened. The house was warm. That was enough. I used to think that losing everything at once was the worst thing that could happen to a person. The fiancé, the apartment, the career, all of it gone inside of 3 months. I used to think that kind of collapse meant something had gone fundamentally wrong with the choices I'd made, that I had somehow earned it. I don't think that anymore. What I've come to understand is that there's a difference between consequences and punishment. The hard year I went through wasn't punishment for being naive or trusting or slow to see what Daniel really was. It was a consequence, and consequences, unlike punishment, are not about suffering, they're about information. They're the world's way of showing you exactly what a situation was made of now that the surface has been stripped away. Daniel got away with a great deal in his life, I suspect, because he was skilled at managing surfaces. He was attentive in the ways that register immediately the remembered details, the right words at the right moment, and careless in the ways that take longer to notice. The offshore account, the covered tracks, the complaint filed through a connection I was never supposed to trace back to him, none of that was impulsive. It was practiced. And that meant I was not the first person he'd done it to. I was just the first person who'd had a grandmother with 11 acres in Pennsylvania and an attorney who returned emails the same afternoon. What I did right was not clever, exactly, it was just careful. I waited until I had something real before I moved. I found people I could trust: Patricia, Nora, eventually June, and I let them help me. I didn't confuse pride with strength. There's a version of me that confronts Daniel the night I found the receipt, that screams and demands and tips my hand before I have anything to stand on. That version loses. Not because she was wrong to be angry, but because anger without preparation is noise, and noise doesn't hold up in a legal proceeding. Integrity, I've decided, is not the same as being good. It's about being consistent between what you believe and what you do, between who you are in private and who you present to the world. Daniel had none of that. He was entirely different people in different rooms. I'd been different too, when I was with him: smaller, adjusted, performing a version of myself that fit his preferences. Coming back to myself in that farmhouse wasn't dramatic. It was just slow and daily. And mostly, it looked like sweeping floors and planting tomatoes and doing work I was genuinely good at. The settlement wasn't the point. I want to be clear about that. The point was that I refused to disappear quietly. I refused to accept the story he'd written for me: naive woman, unstable employee, problem that resolved itself. I had evidence, and I used it, not out of revenge, but out of a simple insistence that what was real should be acknowledged as real. That's not a complicated moral position. It's just the refusal to let someone else define what happened to you. I'm 32. The farmhouse needs a new roof eventually. My online practice is growing. June is teaching me to make preserves with stone fruit now that the tomatoes are done. I don't know what the next few years look like, and I've stopped pretending I do. What I know is that the woman who drove out of Philadelphia with 2 suitcases and $17 in her account was not broken. She was just finally, for the first time in a long time, entirely alone with herself. And it turned out she was fine company.